I think the hamstring training as a whole can be a bit oversimplified. I mean, after all, we're talking about a group of multiple muscles that cross multiple joints, and yet a lot of people seem to resort to just the hamstring curl as their primary method for training them. Not that there's anything wrong with the hamstring curl, but there are quite a few different training techniques that you can use to grow your hamstrings beyond just the beginner level lifts, and using them can help you to improve your physique, strength, and overall muscle size. And to help me break this down, I've got a couple of friends here, Alex, who's an IFBB pro bodybuilder, and Sean, who's a certified personal trainer, to help me demonstrate proper lifting techniques so that you can apply everything that we're about to cover in this video in your own training. So first, let's get a baseline understanding of the anatomy of the hamstrings. There are three muscles that make up the hamstrings, those being the semimembranosus, the semitendinosus, and the biceps femoris, which on its own is like two muscles because it has a long head and a short head. These muscles lie on the backside of the thigh, crossing both the hip and knee joints, with the only exception being the short head of the biceps femoris, which only crosses at the knee. And because these muscles are biarticular, meaning they cross two joints, they assist with both knee flexion and hip extension, making them active in some way, shape, or form in most lower body exercises, with the proximal or upper hamstrings being worked the best through hip extension, and the distal or lower part of the hamstrings being best worked through knee flexion. Because of these differences in hamstring activation between hip and knee-based exercises, in order to properly train your hamstrings, you should incorporate at least one of each type of movement every time you train them, and if you can, try to add in movement that trains both motions at the same time. And don't forget that the biceps femoris short head can only be worked through knee flexion, so excluding that from your training would completely miss out on a large piece of the hamstrings. So in choosing hip extension exercises, it's important to remember that the knee needs to be kept in a fixed position. Exercises like the Romanian deadlift, for example, do a great job of this, with little to no movement in the knee as the hips hinge back, building tension in the hamstrings, and then using that tension to squeeze the weight back up to the top. This is in contrast to a movement like the squat, where hip extension is involved, but the knees are extending at the same time, so the hamstrings are shortening at the hip while lengthening at the knee, removing the mechanical tension that we're looking for to drive hamstring growth. So while the squat is a great movement for the quads and glutes, it isn't a great exercise for hamstring development, which can be seen in one study by Kubo and colleagues that observed the effects of the full and half squat on the volume of different muscles of the leg, and found only a 0.6% increase in hamstring volume even in the full squat group, compared to increases of 4.9%, 6.2%, and 6.7% in the quads, adductors, and glutes respectively. And the deadlift is another lift that involves both hip and knee extension. However, unlike the squat, the higher starting hip position of the deadlift builds tension on the hamstrings and allows them to assist more with the movement, with less hamstring activation the more you allow the knees to bend. Now, moving on to knee flexion to train the hamstrings, holding a fixed hip position while curling a weight up at the knee will do a better job of working the lower aspect of the muscles and will allow that biceps femoris short head to get some work. The leg curl is the best example of this, with both the seated and pronated leg curls working the muscles through knee flexion. And while either variation of this can be a good choice, I do recommend mixing up which variation you use, since the flexed hip position of the seated leg curl will have the hamstrings working from a more lengthened state than the prone leg curl. It's also important to note that with knee-based hamstring movements, the position of the ankle and foot can affect your training. Since the gastrocnemius is another biarticular muscle that controls flexion of the knee as well as plantar flexion of the ankle, a dorsiflexed ankle position allows that gastroc to produce a larger force at the knee, whereas a plantar flexed ankle makes the muscle incapable of assisting in knee flexion and will put more of the work on the actual hamstrings. This can be a useful tool for progressive overload because you can try to better isolate the hamstrings with a plantar flexed ankle, and then once you've about reached your limit, dorsiflex those ankles to add that gastroc back into the movement and potentially crank out a few extra reps. You may also be able to use your foot position to better target the medial or lateral hamstrings, since a few studies have found a reduction in lateral hamstring activity when the toes are pointed in, and higher activation of the lateral hamstrings when the toes are pointed out. And lastly, some lifts will work the hamstrings through both joints at the same time. such as the football leg curl or the glute ham raise, where the hamstrings are working through flexion at the knee while also holding hip extension. And while you may be able to get by in your training without necessarily using these types of movements, you do get quite a bit out of them for your time, and incorporating more of them can be a great way to progress your hamstring training. But that'll do it for this one. Hope you enjoyed the video. Big shout out to Alex and Sean for helping me out. Go follow Alex right here on his Instagram. See what he's doing as he prepares for his next show. But otherwise, subscribe, like the video, and then I will see you for the next one.